Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to my Democracies at War lectures. I plan to give 11 lectures. Here's the syllabus of my course. And the aim pursued is to have a look at the wars that Western liberal democracies have been fighting for some 30 years now, since the end of the Cold War. The objective is anything but practice-oriented. The aim of my class is not to give political recommendations. This is what experts do, pundits, maybe journalists. They are interested in telling decision makers what to do, to permit Western democracies to successfully cope with the enemies they are confronted to. This is not what I will be doing. I consider that scholars have a different mission or different function. They should contribute to describe and identify what is going on in our domain here on the international political scene. They should understand and explain ongoing events. So logically, then my course will shed light on why these wars are fought and on the methods, the modalities used by democracies in order to wage them successfully, at least militarily speaking, successfully. I also will have a look at the normative and the political environment within which the decisions to go to war are embedded, because this contributes to explain, of course, what has been called the Western way of war. To put it differently, the underlying cognitive interest is critical of the Western politicians and the Western media's discourses. Basically, the aim pursued is to somehow unveil, to uncover, to disclose what I feel free to call the dark side of Western liberal democracies when it comes to foreign policy in general and to the wars they are fighting more particularly. Western liberal democracies are proud of their self-image as both freedom-prone and peace-loving countries. I profit from the freedom that I enjoy in a Western liberal democracy to show that they're not that peace-loving to some extent. I will start today with a general introduction in order to have a look at the meaning of war and warfare. And I will start logically with the concept of war. What do we mean when we use the term war? The answer to this question, what is war, is not that easy, despite a commonly shared view. Why? Well, for a first reason, the term war is used in very different contexts. It is used in common sense, everyday language, in expressions such as trade wars or psychological wars, or psychological warfare, paper war of nerves, etc., etc. This is the first reason. The first reason why? Because academic discourses, academic analysis should not use the expressions in the same way as they are used in everyday language. Academic discourses are supposed to be rigorous, which presupposes that they define very precisely the concepts that they are using. Now, and this is the second reason why the definition of war is not that easy, even among academics, there is no agreement regarding the meaning of the definition of war. War, as many other social science concepts, is what the British philosopher William Galley called essentially a contested concept. That is to say, it is a term, it is an expression that has prospectively, potentially, as many definitions, as many meanings as there are scholars using this term. So in order, nevertheless, to try to be rigorous, I would like to start with those definitions of war that were given, that were proposed by various theorists in the past and nowadays. I would like to start with Quincy Wright, who to some extent is the first international relations scholar who, during World War II, published his famous study of war. And this is the definition that he gives of war. War is a violent contact between two distinct but similar entities, a violent contact between two distinct but similar entities. A second definition that I feel free to give you is the one of Hadley Bull in his The Anarchical Society, published in 1977. According to Hadley Bull, war is organized violence carried out by political units against each other. Organized violence carried out by political units against each other. A more contemporary definition due to the British strategic thinker Colin Gray. War is organized violence threatened or waged for political purposes. If then we look at these three definitions, and if we try to find the common points shared by the different authors, to some extent we come to the traditional definition of the very best strategic thinker, that is to say Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general and the Prussian thinker. This is the original German edition from Kriege on War that was published after his death in the end of the 1820s. According to Clausewitz, war has two definitions. He proposes two definitions. The first one is war is an act of violence to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. So an act of violence in order to force someone to do what we want this other actor to do. And the second definition, even more famous to some extent, is that war, according to Clausewitz, is but the mere continuation of policy by other means. Taken together, the three more contemporary definitions and the one of Karl von Clausewitz permit us to conclude that in order to use the term war in a somehow rigorous manner, three criteria must be fulfilled. Three conditions must be met. The presence, first, of armed violence. Secondly, the presence of coactive units. And a third, the presence of a political purpose, a political objective pursued by the collective unit or units concerned that resorts to armed violence. So let's have a look at these three points. First condition that must be met in order to use the term war. First characteristic of war is the presence of armed violence. There is no war as long as there is no armed violence. And this is important, ladies and gentlemen, because this permits us to distinguish a war from a conflict. Not every conflict is a war. What is a conflict? The conflict is a kind of hostile relationship between two or more than two actors or units these units or these actors pursue divergent interests, or they are motivated by contradictory aspirations, and therefore there is a conflict opposing them. But this conflict only is a war if it escalates into an armed conflict. If, in order to obtain satisfaction, the actors concerned resort to armed violence, to violent instruments of conflict resolution, rather than to diplomatic means of conflict resolution. This distinction is important because pretty often the two terms are confounded. In everyday language, conflict and war are used as synonyms, which is wrong from an academic, from a rigorous point of view. A conflict most of the time is resolved peacefully by compromise, by dialogue, by negotiation, of course, by arbitration. This also means, ladies and gentlemen, that since violence must be present in order to use rigorously the term war, there can be no such thing as a trade war. There can be no such thing as economic war, economic warfare. There is economic competition. There is economic rivalry. But as far as I know, an economic war has never killed any people. There is no battlefield. So we should not use the term trade war. We can use it as a journalist, but not in an academic setting. This does not mean that trade wars or trade competition is not important. It only means that I will not deal with trade wars in this course, given my definition of war as a conflict characterized by the presence of armed violence. First characteristic. Second feature characterizing a war, the presence of collective units, the presence of collective units resorting to armed force. This permits to distinguish wars from private killings. According to the French Gaston Boutoul, wars are collectively organized murders and therefore distinguished from private killing. The original statement regarding this second characteristic of war is due to the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Social Contract. Listen to Jean-Jacques Rousseau: war is a relation not between man and man, but between state and state. Individuals are enemies, not as men, not even as citizens, but as soldiers, as defenders of a state. Wars are resorted to by collective units. And Rousseau's second point, men are enemies once they defend their state. This second idea leads to a very important point. In order for war to exist, there must be an attacker and a defender. That is to say, two or more than two collective units must resort to violence. The Latin expression for war, ladies and gentlemen, bellum, has its etymological origin in the term duellum. Duellum, that is to say, two people who fight against one another, a duel. There are two protagonists fighting against one another, one who attacks and the other one who defends himself. And this is the reason why also, according to Clausewitz, war is nothing but, I quote, war is nothing but a duel on an extensive scale. The term war comes from the German, the ancient German Vera, which also is at the origin of the French guerre and of the Italian guerra and of the Spanish guerra. The German Krieg from Krieger has a different etymological origin. Anyway, the fact that in order for a war to be a war, there must be an attacker and the defender explains, ladies and gentlemen, why. World War II, to give this example, is supposed to have started on September the 1st, 1939. Sorry. When the Nazis invaded Poland, and not in 1938, when the Nazis invaded Austria, for the very simple reason that the Austrians did not try to defend themselves against the occupation, the Anschluss of Austria by Nazi Germany. Poland, however, refused to submit to Hitler. It defended itself. The French and the British declared war to Nazi Germany too, but first and foremost, World War II has started because of Poland refusing to submit to the Nazis. The same is true for the Gulf War that started in 1990. Pretty often we consider that this Gulf War started on January 16 when Operation Desert Storm, was launched by George Bush father, George Herbert Bush, thanks to a UN resolution. Actually, the war started on August the 2nd, 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait. Admittedly, Kuwait was unable to defend itself, but it appealed to the UN Security Council, which meant that it refused, of course, to submit to the fait accompli of Kuwait being invaded by Saddam Hussein's army. A counterexample, ladies and gentlemen, permits us to explain this very important characteristic of a war. 1968, the Red Army and the armies of the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia to put an end to the Spring of Prague. The Czechoslovakian people did not defend themselves against the Red Army. This is the reason why this intervention, this military intervention by the Soviet army is not considered, is not taken into account in statistical data of wars of the Cold War of the 20th century. And the opposite is true regarding Hungary in 1956, when the Hungarians already tried to get rid of the Stalinist regime. Once again, or actually for the first time, the Red Army intervened militarily to crush the rebellion, and the Hungarians defended themselves. So this episode is considered to be war and is included in the different statistical inquiries about wars of the 20th century. We'll come back to this statistical dimension in a few minutes. Third, a characteristic of a war, ladies and gentlemen, a war pursues a political purpose. It aims at achieving a political objective. More specifically, a war aims, or is not an aim in itself, is not an end in itself, it is an instrument to achieve a political end. It is fought for some aim beyond fighting itself. That is to say, it is a political instrument, thanks to which the unit that resorts to this violence hopes to impose its will upon the target unit. It hopes to control the actions of its adversary. It hopes to constrain its adversary to do what it wants it to do. This means very concretely that war is a rational instrument. It is a rational undertaking. It is anything, to put it differently, but an accident. And I would like to quote Evan Leward, War in International Society. Evan Leward in this book undertakes a research survey, actually, of wars occurring since 1400. And this is what he writes on page 232. It is impossible to identify a single case in which it can be said that the war started accidentally. There is no example of accidental wars. It is impossible to identify a single case in which a war was not the deliberate intention of at least one party that war should take place. So wars are pursued consciously by those who resort to violence. The same argument is put forward by Geoffrey Blaney in his The Causes of War, at page 151. It is difficult to find on one war, which on investigation fits the description of accidental or unintentional war. Many have discussed accidental or unintentional wars. It is difficult to find a war which fits this description. Kissinger, the American statesman, the American Secretary of State, also professor of history, this is what he wrote in his White House years when reflecting upon his practice as Secretary of State. Despite a popular myths, large military units do not fight by accident. And if we think of contemporary current affairs, Russia gathers its troops close to the Ukrainian border. If ever a war should break out between Russia and Ukraine, and all the more so if NATO or the US should intervene militarily, this, of course, would be anything but an accident. So wars are rational undertakings in order to permit the state that initiated the war to achieve a political objective. This rationality of the decision to go to war, ladies and gentlemen, is at the core of Clausewitz's conception of war as a mere instrument of policy by other means. That is to say, according to Clausewitz, and Raymond emphasized this interpretation of Clausewitz in his Pensée la guerre. Clausewitz, the English translation of the title is the following one, called from Clausewitz, Philosopher of War. Clausewitz emphasized the fact that a war is chosen by political units only if and once the diplomatic means of conflict resolution have failed. If diplomacy does not permit the state to obtain what it is looking for, then war is likely to be undertaken, for the very simple reason, of course, that a war is always both a costly and a risky undertaking. At least diplomacy is less costly and less risky. And this is pretty often emphasized by Clausewitz in many parts of his book. There are 2, 3, 4 quotes that deserve to be mentioned. The one that I already gave you: war is but the mere continuation of policy by other means. When policy or diplomacy fails, then other means, violent ones, are rational. Second quote: war is nothing but the continuation of political intercourse with a mixture of other means, violent ones. War is policy which fights battles instead of writing notes, diplomatic notes. War is policy which takes up the sword instead of the pen. So violence is a rational instrument after the failure of diplomacy. To put it differently, according to Clausewitz, war is a subordinate political instrument. It has its own grammar, but it does not have its own logic. It is subordinated to the general policy of the actor resulting to violence. It is subordinated to the true appraisal of affairs in general. That is to say, a war is rational if it responds to political demands, if it pursues political objectives. And this, the conception of war as a rational undertaking, has been somehow proven, empirically speaking, by the American quantitative scholar, behavioral scholar, Bruce Mesquita, first in an article called The Expected Utility Model of War, the Expected Utility Theory of War, and then in a book which includes this article as a chapter. The book concerned is the one that you see on the slide, The War Trap. In this expected utility model, Mesquita claims that in order for a war to be rational, it must be undertaken if it permits a state to constrain its adversary to do what it wants it to do. That is to say, a war is rational if it permits a state to change its adversary's behavior in order for this behavior to fit the national interest of the first state that resorts to violence. And in order for this to be possible, a war must have a positive expected utility. That is to say, the state must rationally believe that after the war, its own situation will be better off than without a war, which means that three conditions must be met. The expected utility, in order to be positive, must fulfill three conditions. First, a state that launches a war must know more or less with 100% certainty that it is at least as strong and possibly stronger than its adversary. Only if you are stronger, you can expect to win a war. And to win a war is the condition to impose your will upon your adversary. Of course, it would be irrational to go to war if you know that you are weaker than your adversary. This is the first condition that must be met. The second condition is the fact for the state that considers the possibility of going to war, this state must think that its adversary will not change its policy without a war, without being forced to do so after a war. That is to say, the initiating states, the state that initiates a war does not anticipate an improvement of its relation without going to war. It does not hope that its adversary will change its policy without being forced to do so. If this is the correct meaning of rationality, if a state anticipates an improvement of its relation without going to war, it would be foolish, useless, irrational to go to war given the cost of a war. If, however, a state anticipates a worsening, an aggravation of its relation with its adversary, then, of course, to consider war becomes rational. And the third condition that must be met is regards third-party states. regards the anticipated behavior of third-party states. Why? For the very simple reason that a war rarely remains a bilateral opposition. There is a risk of third-party states intervening. So a state that considers to go to war must think of third-party states either supporting its own war or, of course, becoming allies of its adversary, which very concretely means that the initial strength ratio is likely to be modified. If the adversary benefits from the political and military aid and support of third-party states, then the power ratio is no longer that favorable as it was at the very beginning. So the state that considers to go to war must anticipate the prospective behavior of third-party states. And it should go to war only if it somehow rationally can bet on a maintained strength ratio. That is to say, if third-party states support its adversary, it must bet on a similar support by third-party states favorable to its own war. To sum up René Mesquita's expected utility model, an actor, a state resorting to armed force, must have a positive expected utility in order to initiate a war, and more precisely, it must be sure that it is stronger than its enemy. It must believe that its relation with its enemy will not improve without a resort to arms, and it must think that the attitude of third-party states will not significantly change the existing, the original strength ratio between the two protagonists. This model was tested by René Mesquita empirically on the basis of the Comrades of War project. We'll come back to the Comrades of War project in a few minutes. That is to say, René Mesquita had a look at wars from 1816 to the midst of the 1970s. The book was published at the beginning of the 80s. And he came to the conclusion that 3 wars out of 4 were rational undertakings. That is to say, were undertaken, were launched by those states that indeed could expect a positive utility when they decided to go to war. 75% roughly of existing wars were rational undertakings on the basis of the 3 criteria that I summed up. And in social sciences, ladies and gentlemen, 75% is a very significant corroboration ratio. So wars are rational undertakings. In positing, ladies and gentlemen, this hypothesis, I disagree with contemporary authors, emphasizing what they call new wars as opposed to old wars. This is known to be the case of the British scholar Mary Caldwell in a book called New and Old Wars. She distinguishes contemporary post-Cold War wars from old wars, that is to say, during the Cold War and all the more so during past centuries. Mary Caldwell emphasizes what has been called the transformation of wars. Is the French edition of Martin van Crevels, a book published at the very end of the 1980s. These 2 authors emphasize the fact that contemporary wars are no longer motivated by political objectives. They are fought by warlords, by bandits, by terrorists. The wars are characterized by indiscriminate violence. I am skeptical towards the validity of the transformation of war thesis. I will not go into the details. I do not have time enough to do so. The context, I think, within which these two books and other ones, similar ones, were published, it contributes to explain the theses of these so-called new wars. The context concerned are, first and foremost, the civil wars in Africa of the 1980s and the civil wars of the 1990s, notably in Yugoslavia. Now, I'm not interested in civil wars. I'm interested in international wars, in interstate wars. And I think that we should distinguish interstate wars from civil wars. To come back to Moreno Mesquita's war trap, I said that roughly 75% of wars are considered to be irrational. What about the 25 remaining percent, ladies and gentlemen? Well, if they are not rational from an international point of view, they are rational from a domestic point of view. That is to say, some wars are launched by decision makers, by statesmen or stateswomen, by policymakers, not for international reasons, but for domestic reasons. That is to say, they are fought, they are launched in order for the political authority concerned to reunite the population against a more or less imaginary adversary. This, for instance, was the case of the Argentinian military dictatorship when it launched this war against Great Britain, the so-called Falklands War. This is the British expression, the Malvinas War of the Argentinians, the Spanish or Argentinian expression. The aim of the military junta in Argentina was to put an end to the domestic protests against the military dictatorships. Said wars, ladies and gentlemen, are called diversionary wars. Their aim is to divert the people from the domestic unrest by designating and by targeting a foreign enemy to recreate a kind of national unity. I will not go into the details of these wars. I will focus on international wars, and I come back to the point I alluded to 2 minutes ago. International wars, which I consider to be different from civil wars. At first sight, this seems obvious. An international war is a war opposing political units that are at least somehow sovereign or at least independent from one another, separate, autonomous from one another, be they states or not. And therefore, if they are not states, they are not sovereign, at least not all of the protagonists concerned are states. Terrorist networks are independent or separate or autonomous from states, and therefore wars opposing states to terrorists, which are collective units too. Let's come back to the second characteristic of wars. Terrorist networks opposed to states are fighting international wars, of course. So these international wars should be distinguished from civil wars, and civil wars then are intra or infra-state wars, domestic wars, internal wars, that is to say, armed violence opposing two protagonists within the borders, within the boundaries of a sovereign entity, of a recognized state. And the belligerents concerned, among the belligerents concerned, one at least is subject to the political authority, to the central government, which by definition is rejected by the domestic agents that resorts to violence. At the beginning, at the outset of the Civil War, the two protagonists were part of the same state, and therefore we should distinguish a civil war from an international war, though, as usual, the really existing reality, the empirically existing reality, is not always that simple, of course. Reality is complicated. Why? Because pretty often there are wars which start as civil wars and end up as international wars, or international wars that provoke or facilitate the outbreak of civil wars. Concrete examples can be given, of course, the 30 Years' War, 1618, 1648, the one that is considered by at least mainstream international relations scholars as being at the origin of international relations in the traditional classical meaning of the term. The 30 Years' War started as a civil war, as a religious war opposing the Catholic entities of the Holy Roman Empire to the Protestant entities of the Holy Roman Empire, and only after 10 or 12, 15 years or so, France, Sweden, the Netherlands, Spain intervened, so it became an international war after having been at the beginning a civil war. The opposite is true regarding the Russian Civil War, which was the consequence of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, which itself was at least facilitated by World War I. The Russians opposed to the Germans and the Austrians. Another example is the civil war that broke out after the revolution in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in 1979. He was rejected by a somehow significant part of the Iranian population. So domestic unrest started in Iran, and this was a kind of opportunity grasped by Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, to attack Iran in 1980, betting on an easy victory because of Iran being weakened, of course, by the domestic troubles, opposing the regime of the Ayatollahs of Khomeini to its domestic opponent. So the distinction is not always easy to be made. I nevertheless feel free to emphasize this distinction, which is also emphasized notably in this book, which I consider to be the best book on the causes of war, of interstate war. Cashman and Robinson, very concrete and very many numerous empirical examples of why wars break out in the 20th century among nation states. And the main reason is the bedrock assumption of international relations as an academic discipline shared by authors as different as Hadley Bull, whom I already quoted in his Anarchical Society, by Kenneth Waltz, Theory of International Politics, by Raymond Aron, Peace and War, and last but not least, by the constructivist Alexander Wendt, Social Theory of International Politics. And this bedrock assumption, of course, is that international relations, international politics, and therefore international wars take place in an anarchical environment. There is no authority above states or above units. Terrorists, all the more so, refuse any kind of authority, the authority of the states they are fighting against, and all the more so, of course, any kind of common supranational authority above states. And this is the reason why I do consider international wars to be, by definition, by essence, by nature, different from civil wars. And I will focus on international wars, on interstate wars. Once again, let there be no mistake. by distinguishing international wars from civil wars, I do not claim that there are more international wars than there are civil wars. This is probably wrong. Nowadays, civil wars are more numerous. This probably was the case in the past too, but statistical data are not, I would say, by definition, reliable regarding the past. We will come back to the limits of statistics in a few minutes. I do not either claim that international wars are more destructive than civil wars. Depends on the wars, of course. If we take the American Civil War of the 1860s, the American War of Secession, it caused the death of many more Americans than American soldiers were killed in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the two wars against Iraq and even Afghanistan. So regarding the number of victims, civil wars pretty often are more murderous. The same is true for the Spanish Civil War, the Greek Civil War, the Chinese Civil War, the Lebanese Civil War, the Syrian Civil War are more important for the countries concerned than the international wars that they have or not fought. So once again, I focus on international wars because I'm interested in studying them. To say that international wars are probably less numerous and less destructive than civil wars presupposes to introduce a quantitative dimension. Are there more or less civil wars than international war? Presupposes that we look at the number of wars. Beyond the qualitative definition that I gave you, or definitions, a war is an armed conflict opposing two or more than two collective units pursuing a political objective. Beyond this qualitative definition, we have to introduce a quantitative dimension in order to analyze, to describe, and to explain scientifically wars in general, and the Western liberal democracies wars more specifically. We can think of two possible quantitative dimensions. We could say, well, in order for an armed conflict to be called a war, it must have a significant duration in time. It must last some time. Or we can say, well, in order for a dispute, a violent quarrel, a violent dispute to be considered as a war, a significant number of people must be killed. How many victims, to some extent, must there be in order to use the term war with relevance? As far as I know, only one criterion has been taken into account in statistical inquiries: the number of victims caused by a war. This is the quantitative threshold put forward, proposed, and ever since accepted in the field of war studies or in the field of international relations by the Corridors of War projects. You see here at the homepage of their website. I invite you to have a look at the Corridors of War project's website. According to the Corridors of War project, which goes back to the 1960s, at the University of Ann Arbor, in the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, two American scholars. Here's their book, David Singer, the first book that they published, David Singer and Melvin Small, The Wages of War, Statistical Handbook on Wars occurring between 1816, after Napoleon's defeat, up to the midst of the 1960s, 1965. So according to the Corridors of War project, in order for an armed conflict to be considered as a war, and therefore to be taken into account in their statistical data. 1,000 battle-related victims must be killed during a time span of 1 year, either 1 year or a time span of 12 consecutive months, though not necessarily synonymous with a civil year. This is the choice made by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in its yearbook, which every year publishes the statistics about notably wars taking place on the international scene. So a war is an armed conflict opposing two or more than two collective units pursuing a political objective and causing the death of at least 1,000 battle-related victims in a period of 12 consecutive months. This quantitative dimension, ladies and gentlemen, is once again not entirely satisfying. First of all, for epistemological reasons. Concerning wars of the past, of course, there are no reliable statistics by definition. We cannot know the exact number of people killed during the 30 Years' War, during maybe World War I, etc., etc. Even nowadays, we do not know the exact number of people killed in wars for the very, very simple reason that political and military censorship, of course, exists for different reasons. If we take the wars opposing recently Israel to Hamas in the Gaza Strip, the different military operations launched by Israel against Hamas, both Israel and Hamas have different reasons not to publish the exact number of people killed. When NATO, I remember, bombed Yugoslavia during the 1990s, in Bosnia in 1995, in Kosovo in 1999, the figures published in the media were anything but reliable. This is the first. This is the first reason. The second reason, epistemological reason, is that, and I somehow anticipate what we will see in the second part of these lectures, the Western way of warfare, which resorts to professional soldiers and to drone warfare, to distant bombing, aims at diminishing the number of people killed among its own soldiers, of course, among Western troops. Drone pilots are not pilots. They are located somewhere regarding the US in Nevada, and they are not running the risk of being killed. And targeted killings, by definition, as indicated by the label, targeted killings are different from carpet bombings during World War II. So the number, to some extent, of people killed is diminishing. That said, the political significance of these wars is nevertheless important, though the number of victims is diminishing. So maybe the threshold of 1,000 people killed is not that satisfying. There are also methodological problems. Of course, a war or dispute to be a rigorous military dispute which did not provoke the death of 1,000 people is not taken into account in the statistical inquiries. This explains why the wars fought by France for some 8 years now, 9 years actually, 2013 in Mali and in the Sahel region, which did not kill 1,000 people, terrorists, etc. In the region concerned, these wars are not taken into account in statistical data. Conversely, India and Pakistan, who are committed in the state of war since their independence in 1947, as they have fought 3 and actually 4 significant wars in 1947, in 1965, in 1971, and once again in 1999, provoking the death of hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed on the battlefields. This war regularly appears in the statistical data, for instance, the CIPRI yearbook I mentioned some minutes ago. As soon as there is a very, even a limited military skirmish, limited military disputes on the border because of the 100,000 and more than 100,000 people killed since the beginning of the war. So statistical data are not perfect. And I would like to quote here the American novelist Mark Twain, who himself quoted the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, though nobody knows whether nobody knows if Disraeli really held the following quote. So according to Mark Twain, this is the case. Disraeli is supposed to have said there are 3 kinds of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. So statistics may be produced in order to spread information that he or she who spreads the information is interested in diffusing, precisely. That said, if statistics are lies, it is even easier to lie without statistics, of course. More seriously, ladies and gentlemen, statistics are important not as such, not in absolute terms, but in relative terms. That is to say, statistics over time permit comparisons. They permit comparative studies about, in our domain, the evolution in time and in space of wars. Were there more or less wars in the past, or in this century as compared to that other century? Are there or were there more past in this or that region of the world as distinguished from another region? To put it differently, statistics permit to conclude, to deduce tendencies, trends, and as such, they are interesting. Which trends then have been existing in the domain of wars ever since the international system has been existing? Once again, it is not easy to come to affirmative conclusions for the very simple reason that the different statistical inquiries do not look necessarily at the same wars. For instance, Singer and Small, in the first publication presenting their statistical data of the Correlates of War project, studied what they called interstate and extra-systemic wars. Extra-systemic wars, more or less, is a synonym for colonial wars. Colonial wars, however, to some extent, at least from a Western point of view, which is not neutral, of course, colonial wars did not oppose sovereign states because the colonial conqueror, France, Great Britain, the Netherlands, etc., were opposed to units overseas in Africa, in Asia, etc., that were not independent states. Jack Levy, in his War in the Modern Great Power System, where he analyzes wars taking place since the wars of the Italian Renaissance, the very end of the 15th century, up to 1975, distinguishes what he calls major wars from general wars. Major wars are wars opposing where one major power is involved. General wars are wars where all the major powers of a specific period are involved. Even Lewis, whom I already quoted at the beginning of today's class in his War in International Society, takes into account what he calls wars that have lasted a significant span of time. So he does not look at the number of people killed, but at the duration of a war. And last but not least, Halstead, in his Peace and War, Armed Conflicts and International Order, since from 1648, the Westphalian Treaties to 1989, the end of the Cold War, makes a distinction between what he calls institutionalized wars and total wars of the 20th century and institutionalized wars of past centuries. So disagreements, ladies and gentlemen, regarding the wars that should be taken into account in statistical data. Nevertheless, and despite these shortcomings which are inherent to statistics, I think it is possible, or I hope it is possible, to draw some general conclusion regarding the evolution of wars over a time, and this then will permit us to come to the specificity of today's period, the post-Cold War world, characterized by a huge number of wars involving Western liberal democracies. So first, let's have a look at the long term. From the beginning of the international system, we can choose either Levy's date, the end of the 15th century, or Halstead's starting point, the Westphalian Peace of 1648. Anyway, over the long term up to World War II, so during 3 or more than 3 centuries, what we can see is that the frequency of wars, the aggregate amount of war, and even their duration has been steadily diminishing. There are fewer wars taking place over time. There were more wars in past centuries than in more recent centuries. So there is a kind of evolution towards a more stable or a more peaceful world. Conversely, however, this is the second statistical conclusion we can draw, the total amount of victims, what we may call the destructiveness of wars, has been climbing throughout the centuries. For the very simple reason that the 20th century is the century of the total wars. World War I and World War II were called total wars. The amount of people killed was superior, both in absolute figures and in relative figures. In relative figures, that is to say, related to the populations of the different countries involved. There is one general exception. There is one specific exception, but a remarkable exception to this general trend, the 19th century. According to the different statistics, the 19th century was a fairly stable or peaceful century, fewer wars, a small number, of wars, and a few people were killed. But this is true only in interstate wars, strictly defined as wars opposing independent or sovereign states, at that time mostly European states, for the very simple reason that colonial wars were anything but rare and anything but peaceful, of course. Fourth statement that we can make when looking at the statistics, there are cycles of major wars separated by periods of lesser wars, of limited wars, could we say. The 4 cycles of major wars are the wars of the Italian unification from the end of the 15th century to the 1520s, the 30 Years' War, 1618, 1648, the wars of the French Revolution and of Napoleon's empire, 1792 to 1815, and the cycle of World War I and World War II, 1914 to 1945. This statement can be made, but to make such a statement implies implicitly or explicitly to be an adherent of the power cycle theory, the power cycle theory according to which international systems are stable as long as there is a hegemonic power. When there is no more hegemonic power, when there's a parity phase, a major cycle of wars breaks out, opposing a contender, a rising power, to the still hegemonic power. So the World War I and World War II were the result of the decline of Great Britain, challenged by Germany, first Imperial Germany, then Nazi Germany, and it is America that profited from this cycle of major wars to become the new hegemonic power, which it still is nowadays. That is to say, the hegemonic power since 1945. The same was true for the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire, opposing France to Great Britain and their respective allies, though France had no ally. The war of the 30 Years' War opposed the Austrian Habsburgs to the French. The French managed to become the preeminent power after the Westphalian Peace, and the wars of the Italian unification, the Italian Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, of course, the wars of the Italian unification, sorry for this mistake, for this confusion, occurred in the 19th century. The wars of the Italian Renaissance opposed the Spanish Habsburgs to the French, and Spain ended up in becoming the prevailing power during the 16th century. Last statement that can be made on the long run, this last statement, this somehow established fact, regards the unequal participation of states in the different wars that broke out. If we look at the belligerents, the protagonists of the wars throughout the centuries, what do we see? Well, we see that more than 50% of the existing states never were involved in any kind of war whatsoever. More than 50%. More than one state out of two never was involved in the war. And conversely, there are 10 states that very regularly participate in wars, either by initiating them or by getting involved once a war already had been launched by somebody else. And the 10 states, logically, are major powers. That is to say, the Habsburgs, Spain and Austria, France, Great Britain, the Ottoman Empire, Prussia, Germany, Russia, which became the USSR, which once again is Russia, Italy, the US, Japan, and China. So 10 major powers very regularly involved in wars. This statement both refutes and corroborates realism, depends on the definition of realism, or depends on the dimension of realism that you focus on. According to realism, states are like units, or at least according to Kenneth Walt's theory of international politics. Every state is committed in a never-ending state of war, and every state is likely sooner or later to get involved in a war. This is not true for more than 50% of the states. So to some extent, Kenneth Walt is refuted. But since realists would say that when they use the term states, they think of major states as major powers, They are right because major powers indeed are pretty often involved in wars. And this will all the more so be the case in my lectures, since I will focus on Western major powers. The Western liberal democracy that are involved in wars are major powers, not small Western liberal democracies. Anyway, from 1945 now, let's have a look at the tendencies, at the trends from 1945 to the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, what do we see? We see that 4 wars out of 5 were civil wars. 1 war out of 5 was an international war. I will focus on international wars. This is important. Why? Because the fact that many wars were civil wars has an impact upon the nature of wars that were international. Why? Because some international wars, and important ones, were interventions by foreign powers in civil wars that took place in other countries. To put it differently, more and more international wars were actually military interventions abroad. For instance, America in Vietnam. For instance, the USSR in Afghanistan. Concerning international wars strictly defined, international wars narrowly defined, should I say, that is, say, for traditional motives, security dilemma, power rivalries, territorial disputes, their number and their severity went on decreasing. The wars that deserve to be mentioned that took place during the Cold War are the Korean War, 1950, North Korea invading, so it's a territorial war, but also a power rivalry. South Korea, 1950, the wars opposing India to China and India to Pakistan, the wars opposing Israel to its Arab neighbors, the war opposing Argentina to Great Britain. It was not rational from the perspective of Bueno de Mesquita's rational war model or expected utility model, but it nevertheless aimed at conquering the Falklands. This was the aim pursued, so a territorial objective pursued by the Argentinian military dictatorship. Last example, the Persian Gulf War opposing Iraq to Iran because of Iraq's desire to change the border in order to conquer some territories characterized by the presence of significant oil resources, of course. Last statement that can be made regarding the Cold War period, there were no wars in Europe. If we compare the different regions of the world, there was only one war in South America, the one that I mentioned, Argentina versus the United Kingdom, and the majority of interstate wars took place in Africa and in Asia. Regarding now the post-Cold War world, the contemporary period that we are interested in, what can we say? Well, I will show you the list of the wars occurred. We can see that regarding interstate wars fought for classical motives, territorial disputes, security reasons, etc., there are 2 wars that go on, though tracing back to the Cold War period. This is the case of the war opposing India to Pakistan in 1999, broke out the so-called Kargil War, which is the 4th Indo-Pakistani war. And Israel goes on fighting for what it considers to be its security, no longer against Arab independent sovereign states, but against non-state actors, Hezbollah in Lebanon in 2006, and Hamas in the Gaza Strip 3 or 4 times during the last 15 years or so. There are also more classical interstate wars. The Second Gulf War, Iraq invading Kuwait, and then the coalition led by the US intervening to force Iraq to withdraw its troops. In Africa, Ethiopia was opposed to Eritrea, which became independent after a war of secession. Russia intervened militarily in Georgia, against Georgia, and two successor states of the USSR, Armenia and Azerbaijan, were committed in two wars 20 years ago or 18 years ago, and once again in 2020, Armenia opposed to Azerbaijan. Western powers, ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, this is the second statement we can make, fought wars either of intervention in foreign civil wars or wars that are partly due to security reasons, but partly also can be characterized as wars of intervention. We see them over here. We can come back to them, of course, in our next chapters. Twice NATO intervened in Yugoslavia, in former Yugoslavia, Bosnia and Kosovo. The US intervened after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, guilty of protecting Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. The US launched Operation Iraqi Freedom against Saddam Hussein in 2003. America's security was not at stake. NATO ended up intervening in order to support the decision of France and Great Britain to wage a war against Gaddafi in 2011 in Libya. And last but not least, of course, American, British, and French special troops are intervening in Libya, in Syria and Iraq to get rid of ISIS. If then we look at the statistics of the post-Cold War wars, we see that the relative number of wars involving directly Western liberal democracies, or at least the three most important among them, the Americans, the British, and the French, are very significant. More than 1 war out of 3 in the contemporary world was fought by Western liberal democracies. This is the reason why I will focus in my class on these wars. First, chapters 2 to 5, by having a look at these wars. First, I will ask the question whether we should indeed establish a link between the domestic democratic regime and the foreign political behavior of Western liberal democracies. We will then have a look at these wars through the lens of democratic peace theory, and we will emphasize the fact that actually these wars are what has been called the dark side of democratic peace. We will have a detailed look at one specific war, George W. Bush's Operation Iraqi Freedom, which I consider to be a sinister war, an example of a sinister war fought for domestic interests of very specific groups within the United States of America. And we will also see that if Western liberal democracies fight that many wars, it is because they can rationally expect to win them, at least militarily speaking, thanks to what has been called the culture of carnage. I anticipate by saying that Western warriors throughout history are the most merciless and the most ruthless killers in the history of human civilization. I also focus on Western wars because of the specific warfare that Western states have adopted for some 30 years now. Warfare, ladies and gentlemen, the second concept very quickly. What is the meaning of warfare? warfare regards the conduct of war, that is to say, how wars are concretely conducted on the battlefields. According to the American doctrine for the armed forces of the United States, published in 2013, this is how warfare is defined. It is the mechanism, the method, and the modality of armed conflict against an enemy. So the three M's: method, mechanism, modality. This constitutes the narrow meaning of warfare. That is to say, it analyzes how concretely a combat is fought. It regards the hard currency of war, which is the raison d'etre, of course, of the armed forces. But there is also a more broader definition of warfare, which is the one proposed by Martin Shaw in his book, The Western Way of War. He distinguishes the way of war, which is the conduct of war, or the narrow meaning of warfare, and the mode of warfare, that is to say, the economic, the technological, the political, and the cultural context within which wars are fought, within which the decisions to launch these wars are embedded, and the context within which they are made. These wars must be justified. They must be financed, etc., etc. And it is on this specific warfare that I will, to these specific warfare that I will dedicate my chapters 6 to 10, first by looking how the wars are concretely conducted by professional armies and no more by conscript armies. They consist in drone warfare, in distant bombings, in targeted killings, and no more in traditional battles. And then I will look at the cultural or the non-military context. How are the decisions made? How is the public opinion convinced by mainstream media? And which are the ethical or moral justifications? Chapter 10. And I will end up asking a disturbing question related to the terrorist attacks which occurred in Western liberal democracies during the last decade or so. The question is the following one: is this global terrorism, or is this Islamic terrorism, the indirect consequence of our Western liberal democracies' wars? That is to say, do the democratic wars backfire in the form of the terrorist attacks that took place in our Western liberal democracies during the last 10 years or so? This is the program, ladies and gentlemen, that I do propose to you. I hope you will be interested in attending the different lectures from next week onwards. Thank you for listening to today's course. I wish you a great day and see you again pretty soon. Goodbye.